Good afternoon, everyone. I'm PCT Internet Editor Brad Harbison. I want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Keys to Effective Mosquito Control, presented by Syngenta. We're excited to host this timely event as our readers are anticipating another busy mosquito season, especially with ongoing concerns about mosquito-borne diseases, including Zika. We're also excited to have as our presenter Dr. Phil Kaler from the University of Florida. Dr. Kaler and his team at the University of Florida have been doing great mosquito control research, and during the next hour, he'll be sharing some of his mosquito control experiences and insights. A quick note to pass along before we get started is we encourage everyone to ask questions throughout the webinar. You can do so by typing them into the question box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. However, we will hold all questions until the end so that Dr. Kaler has enough time to finish his presentation. And at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Nikki Gallagher from Syngenta, and she will provide an overview of the webinar and introduce Dr. Kaler. Nikki?
Thank you, Brad. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Nikki Gallagher, and I serve as a Field Technical Manager for Syngenta Professional Pest Management. Syngenta is grateful to have the opportunity to partner with PCT and Lawn & Landscape magazine to sponsor today's webinar. We warmly welcome Dr. Phil Kaler from the University of Florida, which, if you hadn't heard yet, the University of Florida's entomology department was just recently ranked #1 in the world, so congratulations. So Dr. Kaler, who will take over here in just a minute and speak to you about effective mosquito management techniques, I just did want to point out that during his presentation, Dr. Kaler will discuss a recent trial that he performed for Syngenta involving the use of Demancias insecticide and Archer insect growth regulator for mosquito control. Afterwards, I encourage you to review the Secure Choice Mosquito Assurance Program from Syngenta, which uses this product combination to offer guaranteed mosquito control on a 60-day treatment cycle. Please visit our website, syngentapmp.com/mosquito, to see how this program can help grow your business. Again, that website is syngentapmp.com/mosquito. Today's speaker, Dr. Kaler, is incredibly passionate and dedicated in the mission to provide accurate and science-based knowledge to help our industry. And of course, always with a healthy dose of humor. As you may know, Dr. Phil Kaler is the Margie and Dempsey Staff Endowed Professor of Structural Pest Control and also the Florida Pest Management Association's Endowed Professor of Urban Entomology at the University of Florida. He is an honorary member of the Florida Pest Management Association and honorary member of the Certified Pest Control Operators of Florida. His honors include the National Pest Management Association's Leadership Award, the University of Florida's Distinguished Faculty Award, University of Florida's Academy of Teaching Excellence, University of Florida Professorial Excellence Award, 2 USDA Distinguished Service Awards, and the Florida Pest Management Association's Outstanding Service Award and their 2012 Pioneer Award and 2013 President's Award. In October 2015 at Pest World, he was inducted into the Pest Management Hall of Fame. He is well known for his research in urban entomology and structural pest control, including research on mosquitoes, bedbugs, flies, cockroaches, termites, and ants. Today's webinar will discuss Zika vector control for the urban pest management industry. We hope you find this webinar helpful and wish the best for you and your business this season. Dr. Kaler, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nikki. I really appreciate the very kind introduction. I really appreciate everything that GIE Media and also Syngenta has done to put this webinar together. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the keys to effective mosquito control this summer. But when I started thinking about the talk, most people are concerned about Zika vector control, which is the same thing as certain kinds of mosquitoes that need to be controlled. So I wanted to concentrate on that. Now, the industry the pest control industry needs to prepare for change in the face of Zika. And one thing that I found over the years is nothing is as painful to a person and to the human mind as a great and sudden change. As a matter of fact, if you take a look here, this is a moment before change for that particular person. They are not going to be the same in the future, and the same is going to happen to the pest control industry, that Zika is going to change this industry in ways that we haven't thought of before. And of course, if you don't want to change, because change is difficult, you might want to think about it that not changing can be fatal for your business. Your customers want to be protected from mosquitoes and the diseases they can transmit. So it's very important for you to deal with change in this case. Now let's talk a little bit about Zika first, and I'll just quickly go through a little bit on the virus. The Zika is a mosquito-transmitted virus, and it recently spread to the Americas. It was discovered actually in 1947 in Africa. And 1947 was the year I was born, almost 70 years ago, and it was isolated from a rhesus monkey there. Since then, it has spread to 44 countries that have local transmission of Zika, and others have travel-related cases. And if you look at the world map, you can see that, especially in the Americas, that there's an increasing and widespread transmission of Zika that is of concern to everyone. And then if we take a look at Zika in the United States, what I found out was that there was essentially $173 million in free advertising for the pest control industry because of news coverage in 2016. You basically could not turn on a national news channel and not run into some story on Zika. And it didn't matter what state you were in. As a matter of fact, if you look at the United States, there were travel-related cases of Zika in virtually every state except for just a few. And that means that there was a lot of Zika going on. Now, they do play with these numbers on travel-related. So, for instance, a person could have been in Miami last year, gotten Zika, traveled to Nebraska, got diagnosed there that they had Zika, and they would have been a travel-related case in Nebraska, not a locally transmitted one in Florida. So there's a little bit of playing around with these numbers on travel-related versus local transmission. But if we take a look at Zika transmission that occurred in Florida, on July 29th of 2016, our Governor, Scott, announced to the world that we had the first cases of locally transmitted Zika, and Zika is transmitted mainly by mosquitoes. It can be transmitted by sex. It can be transmitted by blood transfusions. But basically, they were saying on July 29th, we had the first mosquito-transmitted cases. And if you take a look in the lower right-hand side, you can see by November 4th of 2016, they were still fighting Zika in the Miami area, and actually 2 areas of Miami. And since then, and this was actually released on March 14th, on the lower left-hand side, you can see that local transmission of Zika virus in Florida may have occurred as early as June 15th of last year, and likely infected people who lived not only in Miami-Dade, but in 2 nearby counties. So basically, all these numbers, they have no idea what exactly was going on last year. And of course, we know even less about what's going to happen this year. If we take a look at the cases in Florida last year and this year, you can see that there were 1,089 travel-related cases, 277 locally spread, and we actually had locally spread cases occurring in 4 different counties in Florida, and you only ever heard about Miami-Dade as being an issue, but we had them in Broward, which is Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach, and also Pinellas, which is St. Petersburg. Already in 2017, on the 2nd of March, the state announced that there was a locally acquired infection of Zika, so we have the first one already announced for this year. So we're going to have a pretty good year for Zika, I think, from the way everything looks. Now, there are several reasons besides Zika to control container breeding mosquitoes. First of all, after Zika would be dengue virus, which is a disease that occurs where 1/3 of the world's population lives, and it's a leading cause of illness and death in the tropics. And we've had several cases of dengue being locally spread in Florida in the past 5 to 6 years. Also, chikungunya, which is found worldwide, particularly in Africa, Asia, and India, it has found its way to the Americas, and it also has found its way to the United States as well. And of course, the reason that we're worried about Zika compared to dengue and chikungunya is that 80% of infected people have no symptoms. That means they're going to go to work, they're going to work outside, they're going to be exposed to mosquito bites. For something like dengue or chikungunya, you get so sick that you are bedridden, and so basically people aren't going to be outside getting bitten by mosquitoes very much. So basically, the problem with Zika is that all of these people that have Zika are behaving, not all of them, but 80% of them are behaving normally and exposing themselves to mosquito bites. And of course, during pregnancy, Zika can cause microcephaly and miscarriages. It can also cause Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is the immune system attacking the nervous system. And both of these are very serious side effects of the disease. Okay, if we look at what the pest control industry would be most interested in doing, it would be controlling the mosquitoes that transmit Zika. We have two major vectors, potential vectors. One would be Aedes aegypti, which is the yellow fever mosquito, and Aedes albopictus, which it's debatable whether it is actually a Zika vector in the New World or not, but it has been implicated in Zika transmission in other parts of the world. Now, there are three factors that make these mosquitoes difficult to control compared to other mosquitoes. First of all, they're container breeding mosquitoes. Second of all, they're daytime flyers. And third, they have a limited flight distance. All three of those factors influence and actually differ a lot from what you usually think about as a mosquito that needs to be controlled. Now, the Zika vectors are, like I said, the Aedes. I have those one up top there. That would be an Aedes. And you can see that up on the upper left-hand side is the siphon. It's a barrel-shaped siphon compared to an Anopheles mosquito in the middle that doesn't have a siphon, and compared to a Culex mosquito that has a longer, narrower siphon. And the eggs of Aedes mosquitoes are laid on the sides of containers, and I have two tongue depressors that we put into water, and you can see where the water level was. They lay their eggs right above the water line. Anopheles mosquitoes are going to lay their eggs singly on water, and they have floats on the sides of the eggs that you can see there. And on the lower part there, a Culex mosquito usually lays its eggs in rafts that are laid on the water as well. So the Zika vectors are a lot different from the standpoint of laying their eggs on the sides of containers and having that short siphon. I've talked to a lot of people about mosquitoes, and they say, well, our house is surrounded by all of these water sources, and they're just places that you can't control mosquitoes. Other mosquitoes, not these container mosquitoes, you can see that out there in the wilds with all of that water, that's the kind of thing that mosquito districts take care of. However, the Zika vector breeding is occurring right in people's yards, and often in the yards of your customers. So on the lower left-hand side, you can see some of the containers that would be water-holding containers that then would be breeding the Zika vectors. And those are the kinds of mosquitoes that are very much should be a target for the pest management industry. Now, these Zika vectors also fly at short distances. So, for instance, a Zika vector is usually not going to fly any more than a quarter of a mile during its life. West Nile virus and malaria vectors usually fly 1 to 2 miles, but the salt marsh mosquitoes and actually the mosquitoes coming out of the Everglades can fly 5 to 50 miles for a blood meal. That gives mosquito districts time and space in order to knock them out of the air with space sprays. They do not have that luxury with Zika vectors because they are right there in people's backyards. And as soon as you go outside, you can possibly get bitten by one. It doesn't have to fly very far from its breeding site to get a blood meal from a human. The third factor that makes these Zika vectors very difficult to control is that they're daytime fighters. So the activity of these mosquitoes is not in the evening, in the morning, or the nighttime. They're actually out there when people are outside working, when kids are out playing, and when we had those Zika outbreaks this past year, they didn't tell people to stay home from ball games that might be held in the evening time at an athletic field, because these are daytime flyers, and that makes them particularly difficult for space sprays to work effectively on them. Now, of course, mosquitoes have their Second Amendment rights. They have the right to bear arms. Okay, let me transition a little bit to taking some of the information that we had about the biology of the insect and transferring it into what can be done as far as developing an integrated mosquito management program for a company. So, for instance, I'm going to go through all of these factors. First of all, customer education. Second, inspection. Third, treatment with either residual adulticides, spray adulticides, or larvicides. And then finally, monitoring for quality control in your work. Okay, as far as customer education, CDC has some very nice websites that have posters and information that is very good that you can tell to your customers. Now, you can either print these posters off yourself on a printer, or you can adapt them as a flyer to pass out to your customers with your company's name on it. But basically, they have a wide variety of posters that you should be able to use in your business to be able to educate your customers about controlling Zika vectors. And I have the website up top here, which is www.cdc.gov Zika FS-posters. So basically, you should be able to get all of those posters online, take a look at them, even extract some of the information and use it in your own company. Now, some of the things that you should tell to your customers as far as your education with them is that, and CDC says this, source reduction for container breeding mosquitoes is important, and the breeding sites need to be dumped. However, no one ever goes on to say that the sides of those containers should be scrubbed to remove eggs. So consequently, you can have mosquitoes hatch out immediately as soon as that container is filled again if the sides are not scrubbed. You need to be aware that dumping a container will remove the water. It won't necessarily remove the eggs, and so the sides of that container should be scrubbed, and your customers should be made aware of that. Second, we should talk a little bit about inspection for container breeding mosquitoes. Now, the picture on the right, I have 17 different sites that may be breeding mosquitoes. And in this particular case, we're talking about the base survey unit would be a house or some premise that is under contract to you. And what you would do is search for water-holding containers, and you look in each container for mosquito larvae and pupae. And you can end this search as soon as the first larva is found, or you can continue until all the containers have been inspected. So, for instance, at this one site, this one house, there would be 17 different locations for you to inspect for mosquitoes, all the way from leaking water equipment to toys that are left outside to a neglected pool or a neglected hot tub, or even a boat that is open and holding water, wheelbarrows, storm drains, all sorts of water holding things, like even tires that may be holding water. Now, sometimes it's not easy to see mosquitoes in their breeding sites, so you may want to try to issue a turkey baster to technicians in order to survey. The idea would be to pull the water up, and you can see that there's an inspector looking for mosquito larvae in the mosquito baster. And sometimes that water is pretty murky, so it can be put in a white cup, and then it would be easier to see mosquito larvae in the white cup. And basically, you would walk around you can walk around the property, inspect for mosquito larvae in all of the different containers that are out there. Now, what do you do with that information? Well, for instance, there can be a house index that you would develop, and this would be most appropriate for planned communities. And you would calculate the percent of properties that are infested. And normally, you would say that any number greater than 5% that whole neighborhood would require treatment. So, for instance, if you have a contract for a neighborhood association, you would go out there, survey the entire neighborhood, find out which houses were infested, calculate the number of infested. In this particular case, I found 20 infested houses out of 55 houses total, and that comes out to 36%. That neighborhood should be treated for mosquitoes. So that's one way if you have a whole neighborhood under contract. In many cases, you don't have the whole neighborhood under contract, and so a container index can be developed. And the container index is the percent of infested water-holding containers around a structure. So a number greater than 10% requires treatment. Actually, in the case of a disease outbreak, CDC would lower that number to something like 1 or 2% of the containers in order to require treatment. So that container index is the number of infested containers divided by the number of inspected containers. In this particular case, we inspect around the house. We find 10 infested containers out of 17 that we inspected, and that comes out to 59%. This house needs to be treated for mosquitoes. So basically, this is a very good way for you to be able to document to your customers that they have mosquitoes breeding, or they don't have sufficient numbers of mosquitoes breeding in order to cause them concern. Now, one thing that I'd like to suggest to every company out there is when a customer asks for any service, you need to ask them, would you like a free inspection for mosquitoes? And every technician should be trained and able to do a free container survey as part of a service to upsell your customers. I can't think of anyone that would turn down, with all the publicity that we've had for Zika and dengue and chikungunya, I don't know of any, and even West Nile, I don't know of anybody that would turn down a free inspection for mosquitoes. And that then, in most cases, will translate into an upsell for the company. Now, we've fought this battle in Florida in who should do the mosquito control. Should it be mosquito districts, or should it be the pest management industry? Now, that's an argument that is still going on. As a matter of fact, Florida has made the decision that the pest management industry should stand in the background and the state will take over with the mosquito control districts. But basically, it should be a partnership where the mosquito control districts are working with the pest control industry in order to provide effective mosquito control. And that's because Zika vectors breed in people's backyards. Mosquito districts don't always have the authority to enter private property. As a matter of fact, even in Florida last year during epidemics, the mosquito districts didn't have the ability to be able to enter people's property without their permission. However, the pest control industry regularly enters millions of customers' properties for pest control. And it really makes sense for the pest management industry to cooperate with the state in providing Zika vector control, regardless of what state you're in. It should be done, that everyone is working hand in hand with this. Our Commissioner of Agriculture last year said during the height of the mosquito problems that we had in this state that we had trained the industry to do this, and they were on standby in case they were needed. They never felt they needed them, and so they ended up fighting the Zika problem for more than 6 months because they did not utilize what could have been done by the pest control industry. Now let's talk a little bit about how the treatments could be done. And what they did last year in the center, I have a ULV space spray adulticide is supposed to knock the flying mosquitoes out of the air. The state of Florida decided, and CDC decided, and the health departments decided that the only way to control mosquitoes in an epidemic situation or in a locally transmitted situation would be to knock them out of the air with space sprays. However, residual mist blower treatments can be very effective. Larvicide applications they did a little bit of during the height of the problem. And also there can be B&G residual EVA adulticide treatments. All of those can play together to give a very effective control of mosquitoes. Now, as far as the larvicides that are available to the industry, we have several that are available. So, for instance, there are microbial products, which would be Bacillus thuringiensis israeliensis, often referred to as BTI. There's also Bacillus spiricus, which is microbial, and spinosad, which is microbial. All three of those are available for mosquito control. As a matter of fact, BTI is sold in the common dunks that people buy over the counter. They also have them in mosquito bits that would be for smaller containers. Methoprene is another larvicide. It's an insect growth regulator. Pyroproxyfen, which is the active ingredient in Archer, that is also an insect growth regulator and also very effective. Novaluron is an insect growth regulator and also available to the industry. And then one that's being phased out is Temifos, which is an organophosphate that's been used for many years for mosquito control. So larvicides are out there and available to the industry to be able to implement. And in many cases in Miami, over on the left-hand side, you can see that they would be dropping maybe Altocid, which would be methoprene, into the storm drains, or doing some of the treatments with the microbials in people's yards. Now, the adulticide treatments can be split into residual spray treatments that would usually be applied by the pest management industry, or space sprays that are usually applied by the mosquito districts, although there are many pest control companies that will apply space sprays as part of their service. Now, the residual sprays are basically pyrethroids. Almost everything is a pyrethroid that is registered as a residual spray. So, for instance, alpha-cypermethrin, bifenthrin, deltamethrin, and lambda-cyhalothrin, which is available from Syngenta, is one that's registered. Tofluvalinate and Temperid, which is imidacloprid and cyfluthrin. All of those are residual sprays that can be that are registered for residual mosquito control. As well, there are space sprays, and there's a little more variety to the space sprays that are available. Deltamethrin, edofenprox, permethrin, diphenothrine, and then chlorpyrifos, malathion, and nailed. All three of those are registered as organophosphates as space sprays. As a matter of fact, in the Miami area, they were doing aerial applications of nailed over the population, and there were a lot of unhappy people that they were being exposed to an organophosphate. So basically, we have residual sprays that can be put out very effectively, as well as space sprays. Now, there's some differences that need to be emphasized to any technician that is doing adult mosquito control. The ULV space sprays is a liquid insecticide that's dispersed and diluted in the air as droplets that are less than 50 microns in diameter. And actually, from research done here in Gainesville years ago by Gary Mount at the USDA, we know that 20 microns is the optimal size for a spray droplet to impinge on a flying mosquito. And the thing about these space sprays is they're really only effective while the droplets remain airborne, and they're usually applied as a cold fog. And you can see in the picture on the upper right-hand side, those are small droplets that are being dispensed into the air. They stay airborne for a long period of time. Of course, if the ground temperature is warmer than the air temperature, then these droplets go straight up out of the mosquito flight zone, and they're no good. So these have to be put out at night when these Zika vectors are not flying. So I would argue that the space sprays are not the most effective way to try to approach control of these. Anytime that you saw a video last year of a technician applying an adulticide for mosquito control in Miami, they were applying a space spray either as a fog or as a ULV. And most of it was being done completely ineffectively. Now, residual sprays are entirely different than the space sprays. These residual sprays are liquid insecticide deposited onto surfaces, and usually droplets in the size range of 50 to 80 microns in diameter will provide that prolonged action. And I kind of figure that 50 and sometimes up to 80 microns are optimal for impinging on plant leaves. These will kill the insects that rest or land on or crawl over the tree's surface. And so they're not designed to be applied to air. And so you need to get across to your technicians that space sprays should not be applied to surfaces, and residual sprays should not be applied to the air. So if you take a look at the technician on the right, he's applying a residual spray. Those droplets are a lot larger than the ones that you see above coming out of that ULV machine on the top there. So it's a completely different mentality that you have to have in putting out a residual spray versus a space spray. The space sprays are usually applied by mosquito districts. They're very good at doing that. They're very good at knocking down mosquitoes when they're flying 50 miles from a salt marsh or any marsh to bite people. They have time and distance to be able to knock them out of the air. For the Zika vectors, they're living and breeding right in yards, and so residual sprays are a much better way to go. Now, if we look at these particle sizes that I mentioned, a human hair usually has a diameter of somewhere around 70 microns. A residual mist spray should have something around the size of 50 microns. The ULV space spray is going to be 20 microns. And sometimes down in Miami, you saw a lot of thermal fogging, which is usually a size of about 5 microns. So what you're shooting for is a much larger particle size for a residual mist spray than with a ULV space spray. If we take the Navy does an evaluation of equipment every year, and they're usually looking for space sprayers for the mosquito districts and for their use. And what they found was that the B&G Phoenix and the Curtis Dynafog machines will put out the correct particle size. Somewhere around 20 microns is perfect for that ULV space spray. Now, with the backpack mist blowers, you take something like a Steel 400 or a Solo 450, they're putting out somewhere around 50 to 70 micron particle sizes, and the Murayama puts out a much larger particle size. And so basically those are good machines for residual mist spraying. So if you take a look at the difference in the machine is going to dictate what you put out as far as particle size. Now, residual mist sprays I have on the left-hand side. The equipment that you would usually put it out with would be a backpack mist blower. It would be applied to the mosquito resting site, which, as you can see in the picture on the left-hand side, that mosquito is resting on the underside of a leaf, and that's the way they usually like to rest. And that underside of the leaf provides them shade, it provides them high humidity, and that's where they're going to be resting, waiting for a host to come along in order to get a blood meal. The residual spray that is applied to the underside of that leaf is going to provide long-term control. And it doesn't matter what time of day you put it out. You can put it out at midnight if you wanted your technicians to work at midnight, but basically they could work their normal day and be able to put out these residual mist sprays very effectively to vegetation and eliminate mosquitoes. Now, space sprays are a whole lot different because the equipment that is used, of course, is a ULV fogger, many times truck mounted, sometimes handheld, or even a thermal fogger can be used to put out a space spray. They're usually applied to open air where mosquitoes are flying. So, for instance, that mosquito that is airborne is going to be knocked out of the air. One that's hiding in vegetation is probably not going to be knocked out of the air. You get very short-term control with this. You get immediate knockdown. And that's what our public health people say is important. You want to knock the mosquitoes out of the air before they bite people. Well, guess where they are before they bite people? They're sitting on vegetation, and if you treat that vegetation, they're going to be dead. Okay, treatment when the mosquitoes are flying is very important for a space spray. Well, you can't put out these space sprays during the day when the ground temperature is warmer than the air temperature because it's like a smoke plume that goes way up in the air and it goes out of the area where the mosquitoes are flying. So they do this in the evening time when the mosquitoes aren't flying. So basically, the program that has been outlined by our public health people is based on space sprays when they should be, for this mosquito, applying it as a residual spray. Now, where would you put these residual sprays at an average house? So usually the mosquito flight zone is within 15 feet of the ground. So you would want to try to treat all the vegetation and even some of the eaves where the mosquitoes would be resting. And if you take a look at this house here, I've tried to outline with orange blocks where you should be treating. You should be treating the foundation plants. You should be treating the areas where the mosquitoes are resting in alcoves. You should be treating the trees up to a height of 15 feet. And that can be done very easily with a mist blower without even having a ladder. If you're doing it with a B&G sprayer, you're probably limited to applying the product to the eaves and the foundation plants and not really getting as good a coverage as what you should. So if that makes sense, we did some residual mist blower spray treatments for Aedes albopictus, which we had here in Gainesville last year. And this was a replicated study, so we were trying to see what percent control we could get. And we did it with Demand CS alone and also with Demand CS plus Archer. Now, if we take a look at the first 8 weeks, this treatment was put out once and we had a pre-treatment count and then we went almost immediately to 100% reduction in the numbers of mosquitoes. And we held that percent reduction for almost 16 weeks when Archer was added in. Demand CS, we saw a little bit of failure after about 8 weeks out. But if you're looking at a program that you can reduce the numbers of mosquitoes rapidly and for a long duration, this is really the kind of program that you want. And I try to say that any protected pyrethroid could do this, but it appears that lambda-cyhalothrin is a very active molecule for mosquito control. So one thing that I've run into is there are many companies that say we can do a residual spray treatment with a B&G sprayer or with a compressed air sprayer, as opposed to a backpack mister. Well, with a backpack mister, you have the particles coming out at something like 100 miles per hour. The leaves are turned upside down when you're applying it. And guess what? If you were looking at this particular location, could you really treat this vegetation and house thoroughly with a compressed air sprayer? It would take you forever. You could do it very rapidly with a mist blower, and the treatment would be quite thorough and quite effective for mosquito control in this situation. Another thing that technicians need to be aware of when they're doing these treatments is that some vegetation should not be treated. You shouldn't be treating plants that are producing food for people to eat. That they shouldn't be dealing with applications to, for instance, this garden here next to a house should not be treated for mosquitoes with a residual spray. It would probably be okay to do a space spray around this particular structure, but not a residual spray treatment to that garden. There are other plants around the perimeter that are in between the houses, and even some of the landscape plants off there to the right, that you can see off to the right-hand side, could be treated with a residual treatment. I've had some people confused with the new Pyrethroid label language, and there was one question that was sent to us, and it is, how are treatments to areas where mosquitoes rest during the day, such as under and on hedges, bushes, plants, affected by the new Pyrethroid label changes? Well, as you all know, the EPA has required Pyrethroid labeling to prevent applications on buildings above impervious surfaces. So, for instance, if you take that guy there that's trying out a backpack mist blower, you can see that he's there standing over an impervious surface, and that should not be treated with pyrethroids. However, perimeter mosquito treatments to foliage really aren't affected by this because they usually occur above soil, and you're not dealing with an impervious surface in that particular situation. So, if it's clear, most of your pyrethroid applications with a mist blower are going to be okay no matter where you're putting it on vegetation because it's occurring above soil. Now, as a result of doing these treatments for mosquitoes, you want to have some way to be able to implement quality control. And one of the things that got me last year was that the CDC and the states were recommending BG sentinel traps to determine how many mosquitoes were out there, and also to catch them and have them tested to see if they were actually carrying the pathogens that they were trying to do away with. So basically, the BG sentinel trap is something that they actually provided. I think CDC and the U.S. government actually provided something like $30 million to acquire BG sentinel traps to be able to monitor for Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. In this particular case, it is lured with a human scent lure. So they were attracting in mosquitoes that were looking for a blood meal. Many times we found that over 99% of those mosquitoes were not blood fed, and they were being sent off for virus analysis. All of that work was very rare that they would ever find a mosquito. We did the calculations and we found they needed like 2,000 trap nights worth of data to find a mosquito that was infected with Zika. That's why the local transmission was going on in early June, when they didn't detect it until July, the last part of July in the mosquitoes. They were using these BG sentinel traps to capture the mosquitoes. And actually, a good trap catch can be 10 to 15 mosquitoes in a night. And down in Miami, they were getting up 50, 60 mosquitoes a night and sending those all in for analysis. But you're looking at about $200 for something that you would put out in people's yards, and maybe you'd get it back, maybe you wouldn't. The cooler that's hanging above that one that's placed out in the yard has dry ice in it to release carbon dioxide, and then they have a human scent odor, which is basically octanol and lactic acid to attract in the mosquitoes. Now, I have a completely different way that I would suggest that you do monitoring for mosquitoes, and that would be a black cup. And I looked on the web, and I can buy 50 of those for about $6. Tongue depressors are 500 for $16, and then you need some water, which could be free. And if you put the tongue depressor in the cup and place it outside, like I have pictured on the right, you have something that you can determine whether mosquitoes are going to come in lay their eggs. You can determine whether mosquitoes are there to come in and lay eggs or not. You can determine how effective your control methods are. What we usually say is an average of 10 eggs per trap would require retreatment. So, for instance, I have some eggs pictured up there. You'd have to look very closely for those eggs. And if you can count more than 10 eggs on that tongue depressor, you should probably retreat that yard for mosquitoes. Okay, then we get into looking at some of the data that we had here in Gainesville, and we were actually monitoring with BG Sentinel traps and also our overcups. I'll just show you the overcup data on this part of it. I think the percent control that I showed you earlier with this trial was with the BG Sentinel traps. But if you take a look, we started out at the beginning of this trial with 41 to 57 eggs in the overcups. 1 week after treatment, we were still up around 50 eggs per cup in the untreated plots. We had 0 eggs with the demand CS treatment. We had 0 eggs with the demand CS plus Archer treatment. And we really held below 10 eggs per cup through 8 weeks of this study. So we were out there with demand CS plus Archer, actually had fewer eggs than demand CS alone, but basically you can see that we got long-term control with this particular approach. Now, the reason that I've been hard on the state about their program was in order for them to get control with space sprays, they were saying they had to drive repeatedly, almost nightly, with the trucks up and down the streets. They were also doing aerial applications of ULV space sprays as many times as they could, but they were dealing with coastal winds that would blow the space spray away. And that they were dealing with high rises there in that area where they couldn't even get low with their space spray applications. So I always think that this kind of application with residual foliage treatments with a backpack mister applying something like demand CS and demand CS plus Archer, or even a protective material like suspend polyzone, I think those are actually very good ways to go. So if we take a look at what we've been talking about as far as methods of controlling container mosquitoes, let's go back and think about what we talked about a little bit. We had, first of all, customer education. Go to the CDC website, take a look at some of their posters, but make sure that you're telling your customers that they don't only need to dump the water out of their containers, they need to scrub those containers in order to remove the eggs. Second, inspection. I gave you some hints on how to inspect properties, whether it would be for some place that you have a homeowners association that controls all of the land, and you can inspect into the houses and determine whether that subdivision needs treatment or not. I also gave you some ideas on how you can inspect an individual customer's property and be able to determine whether they need treatment or not. Then with the treatments, you have your choices of residual adulticides, space spray adulticides, and larvicides. I'm a firm believer for this particular mosquito that residual adulticides are a very, very effective way to go, and especially if you put the larvicide in those mist blowers, you have the option of not only killing the adult mosquitoes, but preventing adult mosquitoes from being developed. And then we have monitoring, which would be quality control, where I gave you some ideas on how you can do that quality control with very cheap tools that every company has available, and you don't have to leave something that's worth $200 out in someone's yard to be stolen. And these are cups and tongue depressors can be used very effectively to monitor and determine when you need to retreat the property. Now, last year, because of Zika, OSHA came out with some guidance on the use of insect repellents for employees and workers. You can search for that on the web. You can use an insect repellent containing an EPA-registered active ingredient, and there are several that are recommended by EPA and OSHA. First of all, they have DEET. DEET is something that was actually developed here in Gainesville during World War II, and it's hard to find anything better than DEET as a mosquito repellent. Picaridin, oil of lemon, eucalyptus are also good repellents. Something else that is available is permethrin, which is that's intended for application to clothing and gear. And actually, you can buy clothing and gear that is impregnated with permethrin for the uniforms for your employees. That would not be applied directly to the skin, but it would keep the mosquitoes from being able to bite your technicians. As a matter of fact, the military impregnates much of their clothing, their uniforms, with permethrin in areas when they're putting troops out in areas where there's malaria or danger of them getting infected with mosquito-borne disease. Now, when I take a look at some of the DEET products that are on the market, they range all the way from almost 1% up to 99% DEET, but the information that we have is that like 4.75% DEET will last 1 hour, 23.8% DEET will last 5 hours, and really going above 50% really doesn't increase protection time at all. So there are a wide variety of repellents out there that are available to protect your employees. And you have to remember, because Zika can be transmitted by sex, your male employees need to be protected as well as your female employees, even though the problems are mostly microcephaly with young children. And then just to give you a few tips on how you can change your company to prepare for Zika vector control, especially this year. You need to do technician education on Zika vector control and go through some of the aspects that I went through today with you, because these mosquitoes are so much different than the mosquitoes that are typically controlled by mosquito districts. That they're breeding in people's backyards, they're breeding in small containers, they don't fly very far, they rest on vegetation, they're in areas that mosquito districts can't get to. So it makes sense for the urban pest management industry to get involved and help as much as they can to try to get Zika and dengue and chikungunya under control. Remember about inspections. You should definitely have a policy where you're doing free inspections to be able to upsell your current customers or future customers and show them that you are concerned about mosquito-borne disease. You need to buy the correct equipment and train your technicians to apply them. For instance, the mist blower residual sprays to vegetation are not something that have been typical in the industry for a long period of time. The ULV space sprays to kill flying mosquitoes and the larvicides, also, if your company is using them, you need to have your employees trained to be able to apply those properly. But we've had quite a few sessions with people here in Florida and also in other parts of the country to be able to show technicians how to do the mist blower treatments effectively to vegetation. Also, some safety things that you can put it on very easily if the sprayer is on the bed of your truck, whereas if you try to sling it around on your back, there's enough weight there to be able to damage a person's back. And lastly, implementing quality control is very important for you to be able to assure effectiveness of your treatment, and also to be assured that your customers are protected from mosquito-borne disease. So all of this is going to require change. Change is something that is not really something that anyone wants to face in their lives. I know I like a routine, and I go through that routine almost every day, and I don't like to change that routine. And I know that many pest control companies don't want to change their routine. But guess what? Zika is right in our face. It's going to be a huge problem. And if you approach this properly, all problems are opportunities in disguise. So the opportunity is straight ahead for you this year to get involved with mosquito control this summer, and for you to be able to do it effectively and have confidence that what you're doing is going to protect people. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you this afternoon. I'll turn it back to Brad and Nikki to handle some of the questions.
All right, Dr. Keller, great presentation, and we did get some questions that rolled in. And one question I'll answer, we did get a couple people asking if they can get a copy of the presentation. Yes, we've recorded it, and we'll edit it and upload it to PCT's website and Lawn and Landscape as well. And we'll also provide a copy to Syngenta, so you'll be able to access it from Syngenta's website. So I wanted to pass that along. Dr. Keller, first question we had here.
Actually, that'll be good because I have a lot of details in there that are hard for people to jot down as fast as I had to go through all of this information. I know a lot of this is new for people.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Keller, first question we had was, do these Adulticides have a T&O label?
Have a what label?
T&O, turf and ornamental label?
Some of them do, some of them don't. Maybe Nikki can answer the question about Demand CS.
Hi, Brad. So Demand CS does have a turf and ornamental label, and it does include mosquito control under that section. I'm not familiar with all of the other labels. They may do, but, you know, it's just always a good point to always make sure you read the label, you know, for whatever product it is that you're using.
Yeah, most of the labels have been out there for quite a while, and they do have the turf and ornamental part on there. One of the questions that we had, especially in Florida last year, is what certification category should I have? Should I have GHP or general household pests or household pest control, or should I have lawn and ornamental? In Florida, they said they didn't care, just so you were certified. In other states, they may have some different regulations, and you may have to check with your state regulators on that part of it.
Next question we had was, can you elaborate on PPE? Is a cloth mask sufficient, or should a respirator be used when using backpack misters?
The backpack mister, it would probably be good for you to use a respirator in the application, but in most cases, I don't think that it's required by the labels.
Yeah, I think, at least for Demand CS, California, I believe, is the only state where a respirator is required.
Yeah, that's very good, because that, like you say, Nikki, it varies depending on the state what would be required. We're a label state, so if it's not required on the label, you don't have to use it. But I think it's probably good practice when you're applying something like a mist to have respiratory protection.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, next question we had was, when spraying up high, like 15 feet, the concern is always drift. How do you avoid drift? Anything that can be done to avoid drift beyond just not spraying with high winds?
Well, there are a few tricks to using a backpack mister, and the idea would be that you apply it, hopefully not with a 30-mile-per-hour wind, but when conditions are appropriate. And also, if you walk parallel and apply it parallel to a property line, you don't end up with a drift going over to the neighbor's land.
Question was, what are the concerns for bees, pollinators?
Okay, as far as bees and pollinators, you should not be, that's where I was saying don't apply it to certain vegetation. I had to edit this down a little bit to get it down to the right length of time. But basically, you don't want to apply it to flowering plants when bees are foraging. Otherwise, you're okay because the bees aren't hanging out on this vegetation. They are going to flowers and from the hive to the flowers and from the flowers back to the hive. And they're usually not affected by these mist blower treatments. But you do have to be careful if you have, for instance, a hedge that is flowering and the bees are foraging on it, that is probably not an appropriate shrub to treat.
Question here was asking, what is the preferred frequency between adult residual spraying?
Okay, let me start out by saying with space sprays, they almost have to do it nightly to knock the mosquitoes out of the air. As a matter of fact, for Florida with Zika, they were saying with the space sprays that they would have to do 2 applications in sequential nights, and that's assuming that the weather is correct for that. Now, with the residual spraying, it depends on the product that you're using, how long it will last. And the reason that I like the protected pyrethroids, that would be one that has a polymer in the formulation. I think Demand CS is one that has microcapsules, and also Suspend Polyzone is one that has a polymer in the formulation. It protects the chemical from degradation, and it lasts a lot longer. So it depends on the product, and I think there are different lengths of time. Demand CS, your guarantee goes for how long, Nikki?
Yeah, so it all gets down to, the formulation as well as the rate. So if you go out at the rates that Dr. Kayla talked about today, so the 0.06% of Demand CS and the 0.01% of Archer, that's going to be one application about every 60 days. So that's going to give you 8 weeks of control. We also have a 30-day secure choice program where you go out with Demand CS alone and go out at the mid rate, which is 0.03%.
Yeah, and if you noticed, we had 8 weeks, which is basically that 60-day period that we had virtually 100% reduction with the products. So Demand CS plus Archer, we had basically 60 days of 100%. That's pretty darn good, and I say if the state had gone with a program like that last year, they wouldn't have been fooling around with Zika 6 months later.
Next question we had was, is there any benefit to spraying lawn areas using a steel mix blower?
In most cases, the mosquitoes aren't going to be hanging out on a well-maintained lawn. If it is not maintained very well and you have a lot of things 12 inches high, you will have mosquitoes in that vegetation. Remember, they're hanging out on the underside of vegetation, and a well-maintained lawn is not going to have a lot of place that they like to be hiding. These mosquitoes like shade, so they're going to be mostly on the shrubbery and the trees.
Next question we had was, it has to do with the residual spraying. Can it be done during a regular service visit? For example, like after another GPC perimeter application has been made, or is it better to do it as a standalone treatment?
It can be done as part of a typical service. If you have a customer that wants both HPC, household pest control, and also a mosquito treatment, it can be done at the same time. There's no reason to separate those that I can think of. So I think it can integrate very well with whatever a company is doing currently.
The question was, does Zika infection cause Guillain-Barré syndrome?
It doesn't directly cause it. It doesn't directly cause Guillain-Barré syndrome. But what it does is it affects the immune system, so the immune system then attacks the nervous system, and you can end up with a severe paralysis as a result of it. And it's mostly something that occurs with elderly people with Zika, from what I understand.
Next couple of questions had to do with available resources. Is there an inspection sheet available, and also any kind of recommendations for PPE?
Okay, Nikki, did you want to talk about the inspection sheet?
Sure. So I know that there are inspection sheets online. I've seen plenty of them actually on mosquito abatement websites. I think one that I came across was a California-based mosquito abatement site. Most of the customers that we work with actually generate their own inspection form. I don't know if we have one that's available to share on our website, but what I might suggest is if you go to our Syngenta pmt.com website, you can look up all of the information that we have there for our mosquito secure choice program. And you also should be able to find the contact information for the area sales representative. And they can probably point you in the right direction or provide you with some examples of that. For the PPE, again, always look at the label for the particular product that you are using. But for Dementia, for mosquito applications, PPE recommendations are, long pants, long sleeves, gloves, eye protection, and a respirator is always a good idea, but it's typically only recommended for the state of California.
Question is, are there any organic options available for residual sprays?
I'm sure that there are some products out there that would be considered organic, but the problem that you run into is this, that most of those are not going to be long-lasting. And, if you're putting out pyrethrins, which would be considered organic, then they are going to break down rather rapidly in sunlight, and they aren't going to last very long. Let me tell you one of the things that I had happen this past year. I was talking with one of the mosquito directors here in Florida, and I said, have you tried any of the residual spray treatments? And he said, yeah, I tried it last year, and it lasted 2 days. And I said, well, what did you use? And it turned out he was using a non-residual pyrethroid treatment that was breaking down in 2 days, but he was putting it out with a mist blower, and he didn't realize that just because he was putting it out with something that should have provided residual, he was using the wrong product. So you have to choose the right products for these in order for them to work effectively. Right now, I wouldn't bet for a residual spray treatment that any of these 25B products would be very effective in the long term.
The next question we had was, how does insecticide resistance to pyrethroids play into this? Okay, there's a lot that is not known about pyrethroid resistance in mosquitoes. As a matter of fact, Casey Parker, who is one of my former students, is now down at the Florida Medical Entomology Laboratory working for a PhD on trying to determine how widespread pyrethroid resistance is. And the current statements in Florida's plan for last year and also for this year is if they detect any resistance for a product, then it should be removed from the market. That's far in excess of what the WHO recommendations are for their bottle test to determine resistance, that they say that a product may still work effectively even though resistance is detected. We have resistance to permethrin in some of the Zika vectors in Florida, and that does not necessarily translate into resistance to
lambda-cyhalothrin or deltamethrin, the second generation pyrethroids. So permethrin is a first generation pyrethroid. Even though we have resistance to it, it doesn't necessarily mean that another pyrethroid that is a second generation pyrethroid would have resistance. So basically you have to evaluate your situation with the product that you're planning on using and seeing whether it can effectively kill mosquitoes or not. In most cases, we found that the second generation pyrethroids will work even in the presence of permethrin resistance.
Okay, and that's really about all the time we have for questions. We tried to get to most of them, but I do realize there were a few we didn't get to. So in those situations, I would encourage you to reach out to Dr. Kaler and Dr. Gallagher, and I'm sure they'd be happy to answer those questions individually. So again, I want to thank everybody for taking some time out of their day to be a part of our webinar. Before we sign off here, I want to turn things back over to Dr. Kaler and Nikki if they want to mention any final thoughts.
I want to thank everybody for getting on today. It was a really good attendance. I was seeing that we were up somewhere around 350, 400 people. That's great to be able to reach out to that many people and be able to tell the story about how you can effectively change in this industry to provide mosquito control this year.
Excellent. Just on behalf of myself and Syngenta, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you found it helpful, and a huge thanks to PCT Magazine and especially to Dr. Phil Kaler for taking the time to share his experience and knowledge with us today, and just wish an excellent bug season for everybody out there. And if you do have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Great, thanks, Nikki and Dr. Kaler. And just one more time again, if you did miss any part of the presentation, it has been recorded, and we will make it available on PCT, Lawn and Landscape, and also through Syngenta. Thanks, everyone. Again, thanks everybody for attending today's webinar. Have a great day.